One of the quieter lessons of the Korean War is that cold, exhaustion, and exposure disabled more soldiers during the first winter than enemy fire in several units. This was not because soldiers lacked weapons or training. It was because something as basic as controlled heat, warmth for bodies, heat for food, and fire for morale, failed under conditions planners believed had already been solved in World War II. What the Korean War exposed was not technological ignorance, but forgotten knowledge. Many of the fire-starting methods that had kept World War II soldiers alive across deserts, jungles, and frozen forests had been quietly discarded in favor of standardized gear that did not always survive real conditions. If you appreciate this kind of overlooked military history, where survival knowledge matters as much as strategy, consider subscribing to Backyard Wisdom. This channel exists to preserve the practical lessons war forced people to learn, and to examine why forgetting them has consequences. Fire in World War II was a survival system, not a convenience. Across World War II theaters, fire served multiple roles simultaneously. It provided warmth, allowed food preparation, dried clothing, sterilized water, and stabilized morale. Yet, fire also carried risk. Smoke revealed positions, and light attracted attention. Fuel was, often scarce. As a result, soldiers and resistance fighters developed methods that prioritized discretion, reliability, and adaptability over ease. Unlike modern survival manuals, World War II field knowledge evolved through trial, failure, and necessity. Many techniques were never formally documented, yet they shaped survival outcomes across continents. In Eastern Europe, slow chemical ignition replaced sparks. Partisan groups operating in forests and occupied villages often avoided sparks entirely. Instead, they used delayed chemical ignition methods involving oxidizers and absorbent materials. These techniques produced heat gradually rather than explosively, allowing ignition under damp conditions without revealing light or sound. The advantage was control. A fire could be coaxed into existence under shelter, using body heat and insulation, rather than struck into life with a visible flash. This method influenced later military research into low-signature heating systems, though the original knowledge faded from popular survival culture. In the North African campaign, fuel concentration mattered more than ignition. Desert warfare forced soldiers to rethink fire from the ground up. Matches worked poorly in wind. Lighters failed under sand infiltration. The solution was not better ignition, but better fuel preparation. Soldiers concentrated oils, greases, and waxes into compact starters that burned long enough to overcome wind and low humidity. These techniques emphasized burn duration rather than spark intensity. Fire was treated as a process rather than an event. This mindset remains relevant today, yet is rarely taught outside historical contexts. In the Pacific, friction methods were, refined rather than just abandoned. Jungle conditions, destroyed matches and corroded lighters almost as quickly as they were issued. Some Allied units, learning from indigenous practices, actually refined friction-based methods using whatever materials were available locally. These weren't just primitive improvisations, but rather optimized systems, carefully adapted to the humidity and the types of wood species found in the region. What really mattered was preparation. Tinder was dried and quite often stored close to the body to keep it usable. Friction components, were chosen based on their resin content and grain structure. These methods, sure, demanded a lot of patience, but they worked when industrial tools just failed. The lesson here is simple and honestly pretty enduring. Reliability often depends more on knowledge than on any piece of equipment. In the Arctic and northern fronts, fire, began with heat preservation. In such extreme cold, ignition was actually secondary to insulation. Soldiers learned to preserve their body heat just long enough to bring fuel up to ignition temperature. Fires were often started inside enclosed snow shelters or ground depressions, places where heat could accumulate almost invisibly. This approach, treated fire as an extension of shelter design rather than just a standalone act. The Korean War would later expose what happens when this principle is forgotten, as cold weather equipment proved insufficient without corresponding fire discipline. In urban resistance networks, fire was, hidden inside structure. Occupied cities demanded absolute discretion. Resistance members developed methods to start fires inside walls, stoves, and sealed containers using residual heat sources and concealed airflow. These fires produced minimal smoke and no visible flame. Fire here was not about survival alone. It enabled communication, document destruction, and honestly, endurance under curfew conditions. These techniques influenced post-war civil defense planning, though their origins are, more often than not, rarely acknowledged. In airborne and isolated units, redundancy actually replaced specialization. Paratroopers and cut-off units, carried multiple ignition concepts instead of just a bunch of different tools. Chemical starters, friction backups, fuel blocks, and even improvised methods were all taught as part of their survival training. The underlying assumption was that, some methods would definitely fail. This philosophy, honestly, contrasts pretty sharply with modern minimalist approaches. World War II survival doctrine assumed loss, damage, and exhaustion were almost inevitable. So, fire-starting knowledge was layered, not really optimized for convenience. In resistance movements, fire discipline really shaped both behavior and survival. Fire was rationed not by fuel, but by exposure risk. Resistance groups limited fire use based on patrol schedules, weather patterns, and observation angles. Fires were often extinguished early and rebuilt when needed, always prioritizing adaptability over comfort. This disciplined approach reveals a broader truth about survival under threat. The ability to forego warmth temporarily often preserved life long-term. This lesson, learned repeatedly in World War II, was relearned at great cost during later conflicts. Why did so many of these methods disappear after the war? Post-war military planning emphasized standardization and supply reliability. Lighters, heaters, and packaged fuel replaced improvisation. Training time shrank. Fire became a solved problem until, it wasn't. The Korean War demonstrated that environmental extremes, logistical strain, and human error could still break modern systems. By then, much of the older knowledge-based firecraft had already faded from institutional memory. What these forgotten techniques reveal about preparedness is, pretty remarkable. These fire-starting methods were not just clever tricks, they were, in fact, responses to constraint. They prioritized adaptability, concealment, and psychological endurance above all. They always assumed equipment failure and compensated with understanding. For modern survival-minded viewers, the real lesson here isn't about replicating these techniques blindly, but, about understanding the mindset behind them. Systems fail, conditions change, knowledge travels where tools cannot. Why remembering these practices still matters? Fire has always marked the boundary between endurance and collapse. In World War II, survival often depended on the ability to create controlled heat without detection, excess fuel, or reliable tools. That reality did not vanish with technological progress. Remembering these methods matters because they remind us that resilience is built from understanding, not assumptions. The past does not offer nostalgia. It offers warnings. If you value historically grounded survival knowledge and the quiet systems that kept people alive under extreme pressure, subscribe to Backyard Wisdom and share this video with others who appreciate depth over spectacle. Preserving these lessons ensures they are not lost again until circumstances force their rediscovery.